They say love can make you do crazy things. But what happens when it makes you take the fall for a crime you didn't commit? When a decorated Baton Rouge cop went to prison for the man she loved, she expected loyalty. Instead, she found betrayal, humiliation, and a horrifying secret that pushed her over the edge. On Valentine's Day, she made him confess. And then, she picked up the knife. This is the story of Dejanay Whitlow, a rising star in blue, a woman once hailed as the pride of her department, fierce, fearless, and faithful to a fault. But when that loyalty was met with lies, when the man she sacrificed everything for used her like a pawn, Dejanay didn't break down. She plotted. How does a woman who once wore a badge of justice end up behind bars for murder? What happens when loyalty turns lethal and love becomes a weapon? Before we dive into this chilling tale of sacrifice, secrets, and revenge, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more chilling and mind-blowing cases where every tale reminds you that the people we love the most can sometimes become the ones we fear the most. Dejanay Whitlow was once a rising star in the Baton Rouge Police Department. A no-nonsense patrol officer with a jawline sharp as her temper and a record cleaner than her spotless uniform, she was everything the department wanted to parade around. Fiercely intelligent, loyal, black excellence in blue, she walked the beat like she owned the city, a symbol of what law enforcement could look like when the system actually gave women like her a chance. But what nobody saw behind the commendations and the cropped smile in those press releases was what she would eventually do for love and what it would cost. Dejanay met Keontae Kate T. Massey when she was just 22 and fresh out the academy. Full of ambition, draped in navy blues, she was still learning how to walk the line between protecting and surviving. KT wasn't her assignment that day. He wasn't on any warrant list or under surveillance. He was just standing outside a corner store, leaning against a glossy black Charger like he didn't have a care in the world. No reason for her to stop. No report to file. But there was something about the way he looked at her, unapologetically bold, like he already knew her name. He wasn't the type of man her colleagues approved of. A high school dropout. A street prince turned question mark. Baby mama drama clung to him like cigarette smoke. And there was a quiet menace in his presence, never loud, never reckless, but always one wrong word away from a different ending. He was 28 then, older, seasoned in all the wrong ways. But KT had charm. That dangerous, disarming kind that made you laugh before you realized you were in trouble. He had money too. No job anyone could name, but always in designer sneakers, always riding clean. She told herself it was harmless at first. A conversation here. A smirk exchanged over gas pumps. It wasn't like she was giving anything up. But then he started waiting for her. Not in the creepy way. In the I know your schedule better than you do kind of way. Bringing her coffee, sometimes food. Making her laugh on days when the weight of the badge pressed harder than usual. He said he was done with the streets. That the dope game was behind him. That he just wanted peace and her. And Dejanay? She believed him. She didn't just believe, she dove in, head first and eyes closed. The deeper she went, the harder it became to breathe without him. She hid the relationship from everyone, her partner, her sergeant, even her own mama. Loving KT was like loving a ghost. He couldn't come around in the daylight. They met in motels outside city limits, parked 2 cars apart, pretending not to know each other in public. But in those stolen nights, under sheets soaked with secrets, he was everything she told herself she deserved. She started changing, subtly at first. Calls went unanswered. Reports got delayed. She picked up shifts in areas where she knew KT wouldn't be. Not to avoid him, but to avoid seeing what he might still be doing. Because the truth was, she didn't want to know. Not really. She had a fantasy to protect, a man who loved her enough to change, and a future that didn't involve squad cars and sirens. By the time she was 25, Dejanay had become the pride of the Baton Rouge PD. Her name rang out in community meetings and precinct briefings. She had saved lives, talked down armed suspects, even been nominated for Officer of the Year. But every night, she went home to a man who wasn't supposed to exist in her world. A man with a past that could destroy her future. KT made her feel alive in ways the badge never could. With him, she wasn't Officer Whitlow. She was just Dejanay, a woman, vulnerable, wanted, but love like that, love that burns, that hot, that fast, always leaves ashes. And behind every "I got you" and every late-night promise, something darker was waiting. Because when you love a man like Kate Massey, you don't just risk your job. You risk your life. You risk your soul. And eventually, you risk everything. In 2016, a stash house was raided in Iberville Parish. No knock. No warning. Just boots through the door and guns up. Inside, the feds found what every agent dreams of and every dealer fears: $500,000 in heroin, high-powered rifles tied to 2 open homicides in Ascension Parish, and a row of burner phones that lit up like a Christmas tree once they hit the evidence locker. It was a gold mine, a case made for headlines. And the digital breadcrumbs? They led straight to one man, Keontae Kate Massey. The DEA had him dead to rights. There were texts, call logs, even coded messages from known affiliates linking back to him, not just as a player, but as the mastermind. The type of bust that would have sent KT away for life, no questions asked. That kind of weight? That kind of firepower? No plea deals. No mercy. Just a jumpsuit and a number. But that's when Dejanay made the decision that would change everything. She took the fall. No warning. No second guesses. Just a cold, calculated confession. She walked into the interrogation room, badge still pinned, hair pulled tight, and said the words that made jaws drop. From Baton Rouge to D.C., it was mine. All of it. Said she used her position on the force to transport narcotics undetected. Said she exploited patrol routes to avoid heat. That the stash house was just one of several she managed. Claimed KT was just a pawn, someone she manipulated to cover her tracks. She even backed it up, created fake texts, doctored call logs, and went as far as to forge emails between herself and alleged cartel contacts. It was a confession dressed in perfection. And the media? They swallowed it whole. Robe cop turns cartel queen. Beauty in blue behind Baton Rouge drug empire. They had a field day. The story sold itself. A black woman, decorated and admired, revealed to be a criminal genius hiding behind her badge. They replayed the same press photos of Dejanay smiling in uniform, standing next to the chief, shaking hands with city officials, now with headlines screaming betrayal underneath. What no one knew, what no one even considered, was that the entire thing was a lie. Dejanay wasn't the queen pin. She wasn't moving kilos. She was covering for the man she loved. KT. The same man she'd met outside that corner store 3 years earlier. The man who promised he was done with the streets. The man who kept lying to her, and the man she kept believing anyway. She sacrificed her career, her reputation, her freedom, all for him. And KT? He walked. No charges. No indictment. The DA dropped everything once Dejanay's confession hit the table. The feds were too busy congratulating themselves on taking down a dirty cop to question why the story didn't quite add up. They never looked at KT again. At trial, Dejanay sat silent. Her attorney begged her to reconsider, told her they could fight this, pick the confession apart, force the government to prove it. But she wouldn't budge, wouldn't offer a single name. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Just sat there, like she already knew how the story had to end. The judge called it a disturbing abuse of trust and sentenced her to 9 years at FCI Aliceville, a federal prison in Alabama. She served 7 on good behavior, 7 years in a cage, 7 years with her name dragged through the mud, her uniform stripped, her honors erased like they never existed. They turned her into a cautionary tale, a fall from grace. And KT? He sent letters for a while, showed up to visit once or twice, promised he'd wait for her. But snakes don't wait. They slither on. When Dejanay Whitlow walked out of FCI Aliceville in 2023, she expected a reunion. She expected love, loyalty, a future with the man she had sacrificed everything for. 7 years behind bars. 7 years of waking up to the sound of steel bars, hoping, praying that when she finally stepped out, the world would be waiting for her. KT would be waiting for her. She thought there would be a house, a life, the promise of everything he said he would give her once she was free. It was supposed to be her time, the start of a new chapter. But what she walked into wasn't a homecoming. It was a nightmare wrapped in the bright lights of betrayal. KT wasn't the man she remembered. He wasn't even the man she had hoped for. He was someone else now, someone cold. Someone who had grown, but not in the way she thought. The man who once kissed her neck in dark motels had turned into a mid-level boss in a drug empire. Not the kingpin, not the big dog, but big enough to make the kind of money that keeps people hungry for more. Strip clubs, rental cars, trap houses scattered across 3 parishes. He was everywhere, pulling strings, and yet nowhere. Not in her life. Not in her corner. And Yashira? A name that would forever sear itself into Dejanay's mind. A girl barely old enough to understand the world, let alone a man like KT. Yashira was just 21, and barely literate. Yet, she was the one who lived in the house Dejanay had imagined for herself. The house KT had promised would be their home. The wall she had dreamed of walking through, where they would start fresh, where everything would be different. But it wasn't hers anymore. It was Yashira's domain now. The furniture, the pictures on the walls, the bed, everything belonged to the young girl who was now carrying KT's child, and who KT had built a future with, without Dejanay. Dejanay was a ghost in her own life. The woman who had bled for this man was now just an inconvenience to him. When she showed up at the door after years of silence, she was greeted with coldness. A handshake. A simple, hey. And that was it. No gratitude. No loyalty. No recognition of the hell she had endured for him. KT didn't even have the decency to look at her like he had missed her. To look at her like he was sorry. He was done with her, like a favorite shirt that no longer fit. She was discarded. A casualty of his rise. But the final blow didn't come in the form of empty words or icy glares. It came in the form of truth. The truth she had been too blinded by love to see all along. It was 3 weeks after her release when Dejanay stumbled onto something that shattered the little bit of hope she had left. She was sitting in KT's living room, scrolling through his old phone, trying to piece together some kind of truth. She'd noticed the way he spoke to her like she was a ghost, the way he avoided her eyes when she asked him anything personal. She had been trying to fill the gaps, figuring out how things had changed so suddenly. That's when she found the texts. The messages buried in an encrypted folder on his phone. Text from months before the bust. From the night everything fell apart. KT had tipped off the DEA. It was him. Not her. It wasn't her operation. It wasn't her fault. The bust, the trap house, the stash of heroin, none of it was hers. KT had planned it all. He had tipped off the DEA himself, set up the whole thing. His plan wasn't to go down with the ship. It wasn't to let her take the fall. No. His plan was to frame his own cousin, Quincy. To feed the feds a story and watch Quincy burn for a crime KT had orchestrated. But when Quincy ghosted, when he bailed at the last minute and disappeared, Dejanay had been the one who stepped up. She had volunteered herself because she loved him, because she believed in him. She believed he would make it right. And KT? He didn't stop her. He didn't warn her. He didn't even try to save her. He let it happen. She wasn't his queen. She wasn't even a pawn. She was expendable. Dejanay sank into the couch, her stomach churning as the words on the screen burned through her. The reality of what KT had done hit her like a freight train. She had been a tool, a piece of his plan, thrown away when it was no longer needed. Everything, the sacrifice, the lies, the years spent in prison for him, had been for nothing. He never cared. He had used her, and when the game changed, when the feds came knocking, he had thrown her under the bus to save himself. All the dreams she had built while locked away, the hope that kept her heart beating, the fantasies of a life together, they had all been lies. He had never intended to build a future with her. Not really. KT was gone. He had moved on. And now, it was Dejanay who was left with the wreckage of her own blind devotion. The truth was clear, but it was too late to change anything. She had already paid the price. 7 years of her life. 7 years in a prison she hadn't deserved. all for a man who didn't even bother to look back. KT Massey wasn't the love of her life. He was the architect of her ruin. Dejanay snapped. One moment, she was sitting in that cold, sterile room, staring at KT's betrayal on his phone, feeling the weight of everything he had done to her. The next, something inside her hardened. The woman who had spent 7 years in prison for a man who didn't deserve a minute of her time was gone. The woman who had sacrificed her career, her freedom, and her dignity for a man who never cared was gone too. In that moment, Dejanay became something else. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't burn his things or confront him like some lovesick fool. No, she was done with all that. Her pain was quiet now. She had spent enough time in a cage to learn how to harness it, to make it serve her. And what she felt now wasn't just betrayal, it was fire. A fire that burned with purpose. A fire that would burn KT to the ground. She would make him pay for everything. It wasn't an outburst. It wasn't a quick decision. She didn't rush into it. She wasn't reckless. Dejanay was calculated. She had learned how to be patient behind bars, how to plot, how to wait for the perfect moment. Now, that moment had arrived, and she was ready to make her move. First, she reinserted herself into his life. Not with anger, not with accusations, but with the same calm, seductive loyalty she had always shown. She didn't storm in, demanding answers. She showed up like the woman KT had always relied on. No questions, no demands, just silent, unwavering devotion. She made herself indispensable. She played the role of the loyal woman, the one who would always be there, no matter what. It wasn't hard. KT was too wrapped up in his own empire, too busy living a life of lies and greed to notice the subtle shift in Dejanay's approach. She offered to launder money through a fake security firm she'd started, a front for his operation. It seemed like the perfect idea, a way for him to keep his empire running without getting his hands dirty. And KT? He accepted without hesitation. He didn't even question it. He was too self-absorbed, too arrogant to think she might have an agenda. After all, what was one more lie after everything they had already been through? But Dejanay wasn't just playing the role of the loyal woman. She had a plan, and every move she made was part of it. She bonded with Yashira, the girl KT had replaced her with. She befriended her, made her feel comfortable, like she was just another part of the family. They went shopping together. They cooked together. They laughed, even shared secrets. Yashira was easy to manipulate, young, naive, and in love with a man who was using her the same way he'd used Dejanay. Dejanay played the game, pretending like she was happy for them, pretending like she didn't see how KT had moved on. But every word she spoke to Yashira, every smile, every touch, it was all part of the act. It was all part of the plan. Dejanay had learned the art of patience. And now, she was playing the long game. She started gathering information. Slowly, methodically, coldly. She recorded conversations, always keeping her phone hidden in the corner of her room, tucked beneath a pillow in her purse. She captured every moment where KT slipped, every time he let his guard down, every conversation that hinted at his true criminal activities. She listened to him talk about the deals, the shipments, the money moving through his hands. She captured it all, every single word, every single confession. She started keeping logs of everything she could get her hands on: financial records, criminal activity reports, transactions that didn't make sense. She kept a mental map of it all, linking it together in a way that no one would be able to undo. She played the role of the good woman, the girlfriend who was just happy to be back in his life. But in reality, she was building a case that would bring him to his knees. Dejanay wasn't rushing this. She wasn't making hasty decisions. Every move she made, every piece of evidence she collected, it was all part of a larger plan. She wasn't just taking him down. She was going to ruin him. She was going to destroy his empire, expose every lie, every betrayal, and watch as it all crumbled beneath him. And when it did, when he finally understood the depths of the trap she had set, he would have no one to blame but himself. Dejanay wasn't looking for revenge. She wasn't looking for redemption. She was looking for justice. And she was willing to wait as long as it took to make sure she got it. February 14th, 2024 was supposed to be a day of love. But for Déjeuner, it was the final act in a long, torturous play. She had planned it for months, thought through every detail, and now it was time to execute the last step. She had given KT enough chances, enough false loyalty, enough time to destroy her life. She had done everything for him, sacrificed her career, her freedom, her future, all in the name of love. But today, love would turn into something much darker, something final. She made his favorite meal, baked ziti, loaded with rich cheese, ground beef, and a hint of spice. KT had always loved it, always craved it after a long day of dealing with his empire. He would be pleased. But what he didn't know was that she had carefully laced the meal with fentanyl. Just a few milligrams, enough to bring him down, enough to send him into a spiral of oblivion. Déjeuner moved through the kitchen with a calm efficiency, her hands steady despite the storm raging in her chest. This was it. This was the end of everything he had put her through. When she served him the plate, KT looked up at her with a smile, the smile that had once charmed her, the smile that had convinced her he was worth all the pain. He didn't question the food. He didn't even notice the change in her demeanor. Déjeuner watched as he dug in, savoring every bite, never suspecting that it was the last meal he would ever have. Minutes later, his smile faded. His face went pale. His hand shot out to the table to steady himself. Déjeuner watched him with cold eyes as his body started to shake, as the poison took hold. KT gasped for air, his lungs struggling to process the fentanyl coursing through them. He tried to stand, but his legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground in a heap. Déjeuner was already on her feet, moving quickly and efficiently. She didn't panic. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rope she had hidden under the sink and tied him to the chair in the center of the living room. His eyes were wild now, confusion mixing with panic as the drug ravaged his body. He tried to speak, but the words came out in ragged gasps. Déjeuner, what's happening? He croaked, his eyes darting around. What did you do to me? Déjeuner didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just stared at him, feeling nothing but the weight of justice pressing down on her. He had taken everything from her. He had used her, manipulated her, and turned her into a shadow of the woman she once was. Now, it was time for him to pay. As his breathing slowed, she walked toward him, the sound of her footsteps the only noise in the room. She pulled out her phone and set it on the table, starting the recording. She needed him to confess. She needed him to admit everything. The betrayal, the lies, the manipulations, the drug empire, the murder for hires. KT's eyes flickered with realization as the camera began to roll. Déjeuner, baby, please. Don't do this, he pleaded, his voice weak but still filled with that false charm. I made a mistake, okay? I never meant for any of this to happen. You know I love you, right? Déjeuner leaned in, her face cold, devoid of the warmth she had once given him. You never loved me, KT. You used me. You always used me. She clicked the recorder on. Now, tell me who you really are. Tell me about the deals, the setups, the people you've killed, the lives you've ruined. Tell me everything. KT tried to shake his head, but it was clear the fentanyl was taking its toll. His words slurred as he began to speak, confessing everything, his betrayal, the drug empire, the murders, the lies, the manipulations. He was unraveling, revealing the truth that Déjeuner had already known but had been waiting to hear. She watched him like a scientist observing a lab rat caught in its own trap. She listened to him beg for mercy, to plead for his life, but there was nothing left in her to give him. With the confession recorded, Déjeuner took a deep breath, steadied herself. This was the moment she had been preparing for. This was the moment she would take everything back. She stepped toward him, silent as she looked down at the man who had destroyed her life. She grabbed the knife she had set aside, sharp, precise, ready. She didn't need to make a spectacle of it. She didn't need to yell or scream. She simply leaned in, placed the knife against his throat, and with 3 slow, deliberate thrusts, she ended it. Each thrust was a statement, a mark of justice. The blood spurted from his neck in violent bursts, pooling on the floor beneath him. Déjeuner's hands were steady as she wiped the blade on a towel, her expression unchanged. There was no remorse in her eyes, no regret, just cold, brutal justice. She stepped back and looked down at him, her work done. There was blood on her hands, but in her mind, it wasn't blood, it was freedom. She had given up everything for him. Now, she had taken it all back. Desjardins dialed 911, her voice calm, almost too calm. I need an ambulance and the police. There's been a murder. I killed him. I had to. He was abusing me for years, manipulating me. He ruined my life. Please, you have to come. As she sat on the floor, the world around her beginning to shift, she felt a strange sense of clarity. She had done it. She had taken the law into her own hands, and now she would let the world decide what came next. The world erupted when news of Desjardins' actions hit the media. The story spread like wildfire. Cop turns killer was the headline that plastered every news outlet, every social media platform. The public couldn't get enough of it. She was either a hero or a villain, a woman wronged seeking justice, or a cold-blooded murderer who took the law into her own hands. The trial was the spectacle everyone had been waiting for. The courtroom was packed with people eager to see the woman who had become a symbol of both rebellion and infamy. The defense tried to play it up, portraying Desjardins as a woman pushed to the brink. Her lawyer argued that she had suffered years of abuse, that she had been manipulated by KT, that she had snapped under the pressure. They called it temporary insanity, battered woman syndrome. It was a strategy to paint her as a victim, a woman who had finally broken free from the chains of her tormentor. But the prosecution didn't buy it. They painted Desjardins as calculating, as methodical. They brought up the evidence, the phone recordings, the money laundering scheme, the meticulous way she had planned the murder. It wasn't a crime of passion, they argued. It was a cold, premeditated act of vengeance. The media and public were torn, but in the courtroom, the jury was silent, listening carefully to every word. KT's mother took the stand, and her voice trembled with emotion. She called Desjardins a traitor, someone who had turned on the very family that had taken her in. Her eyes were filled with tears as she spoke of her son, the man who had died on that blood-stained floor. She didn't understand. She couldn't understand. To her, Desjardins had taken the love of her life, the man who had promised her he would change. And now he was gone, because of Desjardins. Yashira also took the stand, holding KT's young child in her arms, her voice shaking with grief. She told the jury about the man she had loved, the father of her child, who had been stolen from her in the most brutal way. She sobbed, her face contorted in pain as she spoke of the future that had been taken from her, the family that had been torn apart. The child in her arms, barely old enough to understand, was now growing up without a father. Yashira's testimony was a painful reminder of the lives that would never be the same again. Desjardins sat in the courtroom, her face unreadable. She had made her choice. She had taken the life of the man who had destroyed hers. But now, as she listened to the words of those who mourned him, something inside her shifted. The closing arguments were made. The defense tried to paint her as a broken woman, someone who had been pushed too far. But the prosecution, with their sharp focus on the cold calculation of the murder, convinced the jury that Desjardins had been in full control of her actions. The jury deliberated for hours, and when they returned with a verdict, the tension in the air was palpable. We, the jury, find the defendant, Desjardins Whitlow, guilty of second-degree murder. The words hit Desjardins like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. She had known this was coming. She had accepted it long before she picked up that knife. When the judge handed down her sentence, the courtroom was silent. Desjardins Whitlow, you are hereby sentenced to 37 years in prison without the possibility of parole. She was led away in handcuffs, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her shoulders. As she walked out of the courtroom, she couldn't help but wonder, was she a victim of love, of circumstance? Or had she become just another killer, trapped in her own twisted version of justice? The world would never know. But for Desjardins, the truth was as murky as the blood that had stained her hands. Desjardins sacrificed everything, her freedom, her badge, her future, for a man who betrayed her. When she learned the truth, she didn't run. She took justice into her own hands. But was it truly justice? Or just another tragedy born from love gone wrong? Do you think Desjardins was a victim of love or a villain in disguise? Could you forgive a betrayal like that? If this story made you question the line between justice and revenge, hit that like button and subscribe for more cases where we uncover the most jaw-dropping tales of loyalty, lies, and murder.